It started with a single message, a whisper behind palace walls that would send shockwaves through the monarchy and leave the world asking the same question. Could Prince Harry really be facing jail time? Imagine the weight of that. An heir to the crown, someone born into privilege, suddenly staring down the same legal system that ordinary citizens fear. Could it be true? And if it is, what does it mean for the future of the royal family, for the monarchy, for the public's trust in everything they believed about the Sussexes? From the moment King Charles made his decision, nothing would ever be the same again. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story isn't just about law and consequences. It's about betrayal, heartbreak, and the unraveling of a family once thought unbreakable. It's about secrets hidden in plain sight, whispered conversations in golden halls, and documents that could topple reputations in an instant. And while headlines will scream and tabloids will spin, the truth lies in the shadows, the quiet, tense spaces where history is made and lives are forever altered. In those shadows, a storm was brewing, and at its center stood one man whom many believed was untouchable. But for the first time, even he couldn't outrun what was coming. You might think you know the story. You might have followed Harry's interviews, read the leaks, seen the media frenzy, and concluded that this is just another royal drama, another scandal to scroll past. But what's happening now is unlike anything we've ever seen. This is not a story of palace gossip or tabloid sensationalism. This is legal action, carefully calculated, unprecedented in its scope, and directed at the very heart of the royal family. King Charles, long perceived as patient and measured, has decided to act decisively. And what he's doing could set a precedent that no future royal will ever ignore. Think about the gravity of it. The royal family has navigated countless crises, abdications, affairs, divorces, and betrayals. But this is different. We're talking about the King of England, wielding the full power of his office to bring legal consequences against a son who, until now, seemed untouchable. Public sentiment might be divided, but inside the palace, tension is thick enough to cut with a knife. Advisors whisper in hallways, security watches every movement, and lawyers prepare documents that could reshape not just a family, but the monarchy itself. It's the kind of story you can't turn away from, because at its core is a question we all want to know. How far will a king go when his authority is challenged? And yet, even as we brace for what comes next, there's a curiosity gap that refuses to close. What exactly did Harry do to provoke such unprecedented action? Was it a single act, a misstep, or a long chain of decisions that finally broke the king's patience? The public only sees the headlines, the photos of tense court appearances and whispered meetings, but behind the scenes, the reality is far more complex and far more dramatic. There are documents you haven't seen, recordings that haven't been leaked, and witnesses who have been silenced for years. The kind of evidence that can make even a royal heir tremble. And in this story, nothing is off limits. Every betrayal, every secret, every miscalculated move will come to light. Consider the timing. Why now? Why did King Charles wait, seemingly watching from the sidelines, only to act decisively at this precise moment? That question alone could fill hours of speculation. Some say it's revenge. Others whisper about timing related to public events, anniversaries, or strategic court filings. But perhaps the truth is even more chilling. It's about control. The monarchy is more than tradition. It is authority, it is power, it is influence over millions. And when that authority is threatened, a king's patience has limits. History is littered with monarchs who allowed perceived disrespect to go unchecked, and we know how those stories often end. This isn't just legal action. This is a statement. Defiance will not be tolerated, and no one, not even a son, is above the law. But let's pause for a moment and consider the human element. Behind the gilded walls, behind the formal titles and the media coverage, there are people with emotions, regrets, and fears. Imagine being Prince Harry, someone who has lived under the relentless gaze of the public, already embroiled in controversies that stretched back for years. Now imagine the person who has been your guide, your father, and in many ways, your protector, suddenly turning that authority into a legal threat. It's a story of emotional intensity that rivals any drama ever staged in fiction. And yet, This is real. The consequences are not hypothetical. Every decision, every misstep, could lead to consequences that last a lifetime. The public angle is equally fascinating. Millions of people are glued to their screens, waiting for updates, opinions flying across social media, news cycles spinning faster than ever. Some cheer for Harry, some side with the king, and some simply watch in stunned disbelief, unable to process the sheer scale of the unfolding drama. It's the perfect storm of personal betrayal, legal intrigue, and royal scandal, and it's unfolding in real time. But what the world doesn't yet know, and what we're about to explore, is far more explosive than what any headline has reported. There are twists, surprises, and revelations that will challenge everything you thought you knew about these figures. Let's consider the evidence, or at least what has been hinted at publicly. Reports suggest there are documents, emails, recordings. Some mundane, some potentially devastating, that King Charles has quietly amassed over the past months, if not years. Advisors have reportedly been instructed to prepare contingency plans. Legal teams are ready for every possible scenario, and palace security is at a heightened state of alert. Every word Harry has spoken publicly, every action he has taken, may now be scrutinized in a way he never imagined. The tension is not just legal. It is personal, psychological, and historic. The world is watching, and the stakes are enormous. And yet, even in this high-stakes drama, there is room for contradictions, for irony, for the unexpected. Harry, the same man who once rebelled against the monarchy in a very public way, now finds himself in the eye of a storm orchestrated by the very institution he sought to distance himself from. Meghan's involvement, real or rumored, adds another layer of complexity. Alliances, conflicts, and motivations all intertwine in ways that are impossible to predict. Every narrative thread points toward a crescendo, a moment when all hidden truths will collide and the consequences will be unavoidable. It is the kind of story that invites not only fascination but deep emotional engagement. How would you feel if you were caught between loyalty and law, family and legacy? Now, here's the part that truly grabs attention. What King Charles is doing has never been seen before. Royal legal action against a direct heir? Against a son? Involving potential criminal consequences? The implications are staggering. Historians may one day look back at this moment as a turning point, a moment when the modern monarchy redefined boundaries, accountability, and authority. And yet, for those living it, the experience is raw, emotional, and utterly gripping. We are witnessing a collision of legacy, power, and personal betrayal, and every second of it is ripe with tension. The drama, the stakes, the revelations, they are all just beginning. But as we move deeper into this story, the most compelling question remains. What exactly did Harry do that triggered this unprecedented response? The answer is not straightforward. It involves a web of decisions, statements, and actions that have built up over time. It involves secrets that were never meant to be discovered. And it involves a king who, for the first time in his reign, is willing to risk public perception to enforce a principle. No one, no matter their status, is above accountability. The tension is palpable, and the suspense is unbearable. What follows next will shock, surprise, and leave viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about the royal family. And just when you think the story couldn't get any more intense, the palace itself becomes a character in the drama. Its halls echo with whispers, its security measures tighten, and advisors operate in the shadows, navigating a landscape filled with risk, scandal, and high stakes. Every conversation could be leaked. Every step could be misinterpreted. Every decision carries weight that could ripple across continents. And in this environment, one wrong move could change the trajectory of not just a family, but a monarchy. The tension is electric. The stakes are monumental. And the story is far from over. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It began with a single meeting, but the impact would ripple through the palace and shock the world. Imagine a room where every word, every glance, carries weight, where the walls themselves seem to absorb tension. King Charles sat at the head of the long mahogany table, advisors clustered nervously around him, their eyes flicking between documents, phones, and the unmistakable storm brewing in the king's expression. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, a mix of formality and raw emotion. No one spoke. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation. And then, without preamble, Charles addressed the room, his voice calm but edged with steel. Enough is enough. This stops now. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the kind of calm that signals peace. It was the calm before a hurricane. Every advisor in that room knew exactly what he meant. Prince Harry's actions, his public statements, his defiance, his constant media engagements, all of it had crossed lines that could no longer be ignored. The king's fury was not a spur-of-the-moment reaction. It had been simmering for months, quietly, deliberately, as he watched the youngest son undermine everything the monarchy stood for. The patience of decades had reached its limit, and the king was now ready to act decisively. What Harry didn't realize was that this wasn't about personal anger. This was strategy. King Charles had always been methodical, calculating. Public displays of emotion, yes, but every step in this moment was the result of careful planning. Every word weighed against potential outcomes. Advisors whispered, unsure if they should speak, fearing the king's measured but unmistakable intensity. It was a dangerous moment. The smallest misstep could trigger an eruption that would engulf the entire royal family in scandal and legal turmoil. And yet, Charles remained composed. His gaze swept the room, silently asserting authority, demanding loyalty, and signaling that nothing, not even the rebellious actions of a son, would go unchallenged. In the hours and days leading up to this meeting, palace security had been tightened. The private corridors, once bustling with aides and courtiers, were now quiet, almost eerily so. Whispers were discouraged, rumors were already circulating, and the last thing the king needed was another leak. The royal legal team had been consulted in secret, drafting strategies, contingency plans, and confidential documents that outlined potential paths forward. They were prepared for every eventuality, every possible challenge, every media frenzy that could erupt. And at the center of it all was one man, sitting quietly, simmering with a fury that would soon manifest in the most public way possible. The breaking point had not happened overnight. It had been building for years, layer upon layer of perceived disrespect and disregard for royal protocols. Harry's interviews, his unauthorized statements, his public critiques of the monarchy, all had chipped away at the institution's image. Advisors recalled long nights spent drafting carefully worded responses, damage control efforts that seemed to fail at every turn. And now, the king had reached a decisive moment. The calculus was simple: protect the monarchy at all costs, and ensure that no precedent of defiance went unanswered. The stakes were higher than ever. The question was not whether action would be taken, but how, and with what consequences. Inside the palace, tension was palpable. Security personnel monitored communications, ensuring that nothing left the room. The king's aides, normally confident and composed, fidgeted nervously, aware that the course of history could pivot on the decisions made here. They were witnessing a transformation, a king stepping from patience into action, from deliberation into forceful assertion. And in the eye of this storm was Harry, whose absence from this specific meeting did not exempt him from its effects. His actions had been tracked, catalogued, and analyzed, every move scrutinized for evidence of misconduct or breach of protocol. Charles's decision was clear: the law would be leveraged, and public accountability would not be optional. It was during this critical juncture that advisors presented the evidence. Documents, emails, transcripts of recorded conversations, all carefully compiled, redacted, and arranged to paint a coherent picture of repeated violations. Each piece was discussed in hushed tones, with legal experts highlighting the potential impact, the vulnerabilities, and the path forward. But what caught the attention of everyone in the room was not just the evidence itself, it was the sheer audacity of it. Some of the revelations were shocking even to those who had followed Harry closely for years. Missteps, misjudgments, and moments of apparent recklessness, once dismissed as youthful indiscretion, were now framed as significant breaches with serious implications. As the meeting progressed, the king's resolve became palpable. He was no longer the patient father trying to guide a son. He was the sovereign, aware of the weight of his authority and the eyes of history upon him. The advisors knew better than to question his judgment. The stakes were enormous, not just personal, but institutional. The monarchy's reputation, its stability, and its relationship with the public were all at risk. And in that moment, it became clear. Action was inevitable, and the consequences would be profound. King Charles was acutely aware of the public dimension. Media outlets were hungry for any sign of discord. Social media amplified even the smallest rumor. Every misstep, every leaked document, every statement could ignite a global firestorm. But Charles was undeterred. His strategy was meticulous. Act decisively, communicate carefully, and leverage the legal system to assert authority while minimizing collateral damage. It was a balancing act, fraught with risk, but the king understood that the alternative, inaction, was far worse. The monarchy's credibility was at stake, and he would not allow personal emotion to dictate the course of history. And yet, even in this calculated storm, there was room for tension, for uncertainty, for human emotion. Advisors whispered about how Harry might react, speculating on the personal and public fallout. Would he comply? Would he challenge the authority of his father publicly? Would he seek allies outside the palace? Each possibility carried enormous risk, and every scenario had been considered in the king's strategy. What unfolded next would test loyalties, reveal hidden alliances, and force the royal family into uncharted territory. The quiet corridors of the palace, so carefully controlled, were about to become the stage for a dramatic confrontation whose reverberations would be felt across the globe. By the time the meeting concluded, one thing was clear. King Charles had made his decision. The patience that had defined his leadership was exhausted, replaced by a resolve that left no room for negotiation or delay. Legal action would be taken, and Prince Harry would be held accountable for actions long overlooked or tolerated. The advisors left the room with a sense of foreboding, aware that the coming days would be critical. The king's resolve had shifted the balance of power, and the implications were immediate and severe. Every move Harry had made, every statement, every public act, would now be scrutinized through a lens of legality and accountability. There was no turning back. But even as the palace braces for the legal storm, the world outside remains unaware of the full scale of what is about to unfold. Headlines will break, social media will erupt, and public opinion will polarize. Yet the most critical events, those that will define the trajectory of the royal family, are happening in private, behind locked doors and guarded corridors. King Charles's decision is a turning point, a moment of clarity and force that will shape the monarchy for years to come. And as advisors and aides scramble to execute the king's directives, one question hangs in the air. How will Prince Harry respond when the full weight of this legal action lands squarely on his shoulders? The breaking point has arrived, but the story is far from over. What happens when a son faces the full authority of a father who is also the king? What happens when loyalty is tested, when betrayal is uncovered, when consequences are no longer theoretical but inevitable? The tension, the stakes, and the drama are just beginning. And as the world watches, unaware of the full scope of the events unfolding, one thing is certain. The royal family is about to experience a reckoning unlike anything in modern history. But what Harry did next, and how he would respond to his father's unprecedented action, would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Prince Harry's journey toward this unprecedented legal showdown didn't happen overnight. It was a series of decisions, public statements, and private missteps that, layer by layer, eroded the patience of the monarchy and pushed King Charles to the breaking point. To understand why legal action became inevitable, we need to step back and examine the trail of events that led to this moment. A trail marked by controversy, media attention, and choices that many considered reckless, even for a royal. It started with interviews. Harry, once the golden prince of the public eye, had gradually transitioned into a figure of contradiction. On one hand, he was the dutiful son, the former military officer, and the philanthropist committed to global causes. On the other, he became increasingly vocal about grievances, personal frustrations, and criticisms of the institution that had raised him. Each interview added fuel to the fire. He spoke candidly about family tensions, protocols, and personal betrayals. To the public, these moments were shocking, even compelling, painting Harry as a misunderstood figure standing up to centuries of tradition. But within the palace, every word felt like a breach of trust, a crack in the delicate facade of royal discretion that had been cultivated for generations. There was irony in every statement Harry made. When he criticized media intrusion, he inadvertently amplified attention, turning personal complaints into global spectacles. When he spoke about freedom and autonomy, he exposed private conflicts and legal vulnerabilities that had previously been shielded. Every choice, from public appearances to strategic social media posts, was a double-edged sword. The advisors recognized patterns, behaviors that, if left unchecked, could compromise not only Harry's reputation but the monarchy's authority. It wasn't just about public perception. It was about precedent. If a prince could openly challenge royal protocols without consequence, the institution itself risked appearing weak, incapable of enforcing accountability. One of the most controversial decisions was Harry's series of public statements regarding sensitive family matters. He spoke about his upbringing, the pressures of royal life, and the sense of isolation he experienced. While some applauded his honesty, others saw it as betrayal. Certain confidences shared in private became fodder for headlines. Confidential letters and documents, once shielded from the public, were referenced indirectly or leaked, whether intentionally or not. The palace viewed these as breaches of trust and potential legal liabilities. The perception of disloyalty, when combined with the visibility of his actions, created a perfect storm. It wasn't just what Harry said. It was the timing, the context, and the consequences that could not be ignored. Harry's choice to engage with international media outlets further intensified the situation. The global stage amplified every statement, giving it reach far beyond what the monarchy could control. Interviews conducted in the United States, in particular, reached audiences that were outside traditional royal oversight. Each comment was dissected, analyzed, and shared, creating a continuous feedback loop that magnified any misstep. The king and his advisors had to consider the cumulative effect of these appearances. It wasn't a single interview or a single quote that triggered action. It was the pattern, the consistency, and the growing boldness of Harry's public engagements. And then there were the legal and financial controversies. While not widely reported at the time, certain decisions made by Harry had direct implications for the monarchy's operational protocols. Unauthorized deals, fundraising initiatives conducted outside established channels, and agreements made without palace approval created a legal vulnerability that advisors could not ignore. Every move, whether motivated by independence, ambition, or idealism, carried potential consequences that were now crystallizing. The king could not allow precedent to be set. The family's reputation, the integrity of royal operations, and the authority of the throne were all on the line. In addition to public actions, there were private disputes that contributed to the tipping point. Sources indicate that Harry engaged in behind-the-scenes conflicts with palace staff and advisors. Some of these disputes were financial, others interpersonal, and a few involved sensitive operational matters that, if leaked, could have created scandal. While many of these instances remained undocumented in the media, they were noted in private records and internal communications. Over time, they formed a pattern of behavior that the king's legal team cataloged meticulously. Each instance, seemingly small in isolation, became significant when viewed as part of a broader trajectory of actions that challenged authority and protocol. Then came the perceived betrayals of loyalty. Royals, particularly senior members of the family, operate under strict codes of discretion and alignment. Publicly airing grievances, bypassing protocol, or engaging with external parties without authorization are not merely frowned upon. They are seen as direct threats to the institution's credibility. Harry's repeated public critiques, combined with actions interpreted as subverting authority, were considered breaches of trust severe enough to warrant formal action. King Charles, who had tolerated minor infractions and private complaints, recognized that inaction now would signal weakness. The time for patience had passed. It's important to note the irony of Harry's position. He had, in many ways, sought independence from the monarchy, pursuing personal projects, media deals, and charitable initiatives. Yet, this very independence created a legal and reputational exposure he could not control. In attempting to distance himself from the institution, he inadvertently created vulnerabilities that were now being exploited, legally and strategically, by the very authority he had once resisted. The king's team was methodical, identifying every point of leverage, every documented misstep, and every public statement that could justify action. But it wasn't just strategy that drove the king's decision. Emotion played a role, as it always does in family disputes, even at the highest levels. The combination of disappointment, betrayal, and concern for the monarchy's legacy created a sense of urgency. Advisors later described the king's demeanor as calm, controlled, yet unmistakably resolute, a man who had reached the end of his tolerance. This emotional dimension added weight to the legal considerations. It wasn't simply about law or protocol. It was about enforcing respect, loyalty, and accountability in a situation that had long been allowed to spiral. The tipping point came when Harry's actions crossed a line involving confidential correspondence and internal palace communications. Documents that were meant to remain private, including sensitive financial and legal memos, were allegedly referenced or leaked during interviews and public discussions. To the king, this was more than a breach. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the monarchy and the security of the institution. The legal team's response was swift. They cataloged each incident, assessed potential repercussions, and prepared the first steps of formal action. What might have been overlooked or mitigated in years past was now concrete, actionable evidence that could not be ignored. As advisors briefed the king, the scale of Harry's past moves became undeniable. Each interview, each unauthorized initiative, and each breach of protocol was connected, forming a narrative of behavior that suggested not only defiance but also recklessness. What had been tolerated as youthful impulsiveness or temporary rebellion was now viewed as a pattern that demanded intervention. Legal options were assessed, public messaging considered, and potential outcomes debated in exhaustive detail. Every scenario, from compliance to resistance, was explored. The consensus was clear. Action was unavoidable, and it had to be decisive. The emotional stakes were also public. The monarchy exists not only as a private family, but as a symbol for millions. Public perception mattered. Every misstep could undermine authority, credibility, and historical legacy. Harry's actions, interpreted through the lens of international media and public opinion, created pressure not only internally but externally. The king had to balance emotion, legality, and optics, ensuring that the response reinforced authority without igniting further scandal. It was an impossible balancing act, and yet, one he approached with precision. Finally, as the legal framework was being prepared, there was recognition that Harry himself may not have fully understood the severity of his actions. He had underestimated the reach of the monarchy, the extent of scrutiny, and the consequences of publicizing private matters. Every calculated move he had made, intended to assert independence, now fed directly into the rationale for legal action. What he considered rebellion or freedom of expression was, from the king's perspective, a breach of duty, loyalty, and legal responsibility. And just as advisors began drafting formal notifications, the first signs of public speculation emerged. Rumors circulated online, media outlets caught wind of internal disputes, and the tension of inevitability hung over the palace. Harry's past moves, once scattered incidents, had coalesced into a narrative that left little room for leniency. The legal machinery was in motion, the king's resolve was unshakable, and the consequences were about to unfold in full view of the world. But what Harry thought would be a private storm of letters and warnings was about to erupt into a spectacle that would challenge everything he believed about loyalty, family, and the reach of the law. And what came next would shock even the closest royal aides, and the public had no idea how explosive the next chapter would be. What if I told you that every move Prince Harry ever made, every interview, every message, every public appearance, had been meticulously tracked, analyzed, and catalogued? That behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, a silent war of documents, recordings, and testimonies was being waged, each piece designed to build a case that could bring the rebellious prince to his knees. It's true. And this is the story the world hasn't seen, because what King Charles had been quietly assembling was nothing short of explosive. The king, patient and deliberate, had long understood the importance of evidence. In the royal world, appearances can be deceiving. A smile in public, a casual interview, even a handshake could mask tensions so profound they would make ordinary observers gasp. But Charles's legal team wasn't working in ordinary terms. They were operating with precision, hunting for patterns, inconsistencies, and moments of indiscretion that would support a legal case capable of challenging Harry in ways no one expected. This was a meticulous process that required patience, discretion, and absolute control over every detail. It began with internal correspondence. Emails between Harry and various staff members, confidential notes, and even handwritten letters, all were scrutinized. Each communication was analyzed for tone, intent, and potential breaches of protocol. Advisors had long suspected that Harry's public grievances were mirrored privately, in ways that exposed vulnerabilities, conflicts, and inconsistencies. What seemed at first glance to be harmless discussions about logistics or family matters were, in the eyes of the king's legal team, evidence of a larger pattern of behavior that undermined the monarchy. But it wasn't just emails. Phone calls, text messages, and even WhatsApp threads were examined. Certain private conversations, leaked in fragments over the years, were pieced together to form a coherent narrative. Advisors worked with forensic specialists, tracing digital footprints, metadata, and timelines to ensure that every message could be authenticated. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail mattered, and the team understood that the weight of these records could be decisive. They weren't looking for scandal alone. They were looking for actionable evidence that would leave no room for defense. Then there were recordings. Some public, some private, some alleged to exist but never revealed. Over time, the palace had quietly obtained recordings from a variety of sources: staff interactions, private conversations, and occasionally, interviews conducted with the intent of documenting Harry's statements. Each recording was cataloged, time-stamped, and analyzed for context. Legal experts within the palace emphasized the importance of framing these recordings correctly. One misinterpreted clip could be dismissed, but a series of clips, strategically compiled, could build an airtight narrative. It was a strategy of accumulation. Individually, the incidents might seem minor, but together, they painted a story that was impossible to ignore. Financial records added another layer. Certain projects and initiatives that Harry had undertaken outside traditional palace channels were examined. Accounts, contracts, and financial statements were all assessed for compliance, oversight, and authorization. Advisors noted every irregularity, every deviation from protocol, and every potential point of liability. In doing so, they weren't just collecting evidence of past actions. They were identifying vulnerabilities that could be leveraged in legal proceedings. Each detail, no matter how small, contributed to a broader picture of mismanagement, neglect, or defiance. Legal advisors also consulted internal witnesses, individuals who had first-hand knowledge of Harry's actions and decisions. These were aides, staff, and confidants who had been present during key events, from meetings to family discussions. Their testimonies were carefully documented, cross-referenced, and verified. Some agreed to provide accounts only under strict confidentiality, understanding the gravity of the situation. Their statements offered insights into Harry's intentions, his attitude toward protocols, and his awareness of the consequences of his actions. Collectively, these testimonies became one of the most significant pillars of the evidence the king's team was assembling. It's important to understand that this evidence wasn't assembled overnight. King Charles and his advisors had been quietly observing, recording, and analyzing for months, if not years. Every public interview, every controversial statement, every media appearance was logged, evaluated, and connected to previous actions. What appeared to be spontaneous decisions by Harry were, in reality, being mapped onto a growing web of accountability. The legal team's work was almost surgical, precise in its intent, and exhaustive in scope. They understood that the credibility of the case depended not on sensationalism, but on clarity, accuracy, and indisputable documentation. But what makes this evidence particularly damning is not its quantity, but its quality. Certain recordings and documents revealed behavior that, while previously hidden, cast Harry's decisions in a dramatically different light. Private statements contradicted public claims. Alleged intentions conflicted with documented actions. The king's team didn't need to exaggerate. They simply compiled the truth, and the truth, when presented in its full context, was devastating. Advisors repeatedly emphasized that Harry's public persona, one carefully cultivated over years of media appearances, was only a partial picture. The evidence revealed inconsistencies, contradictions, and actions that could not be reconciled with his claims of innocence or misunderstanding. Even more shocking were the previously undisclosed communications between Harry and third parties, some of which involved discussions that, if made public, could harm the monarchy's reputation and potentially violate legal boundaries. These interactions, once considered confidential, became crucial to understanding the extent of his actions. Advisors documented these interactions with extreme caution, ensuring that each could withstand scrutiny in any potential legal or public forum. The team knew that exposure of these materials at the right time would not only strengthen the king's position, but also change public perception. Surprisingly, some evidence even came from sources outside the palace: foreign media, international correspondence, and allied institutions that had interacted with Harry. These external records, when combined with internal documents, created a mosaic of activity that left little room for interpretation. Each piece, when analyzed in context, contributed to a narrative of repeated defiance, mismanagement, or disloyalty. The king's team knew that they held a compelling case, one that could not easily be dismissed, ignored, or spun by the public relations apparatus that Harry had relied on in the past. And yet, the process of gathering evidence was not merely mechanical. Advisors recognized the emotional stakes. King Charles was acutely aware that using this evidence would involve not just legal authority, but personal consequences. Confronting a son with documented proof of misconduct, some of it deeply personal, was fraught with tension. The king's approach had to be firm, precise, and unwavering, balancing legal necessity with the sensitivity required for family dynamics. Every choice in this process was deliberate, designed to ensure that the response would be both effective and enduring. There were moments of debate among advisors. Some worried about the public reaction, the possibility of backlash, or unintended consequences. Others emphasized that hesitation would only embolden further defiance. In private, some remarked that the accumulation of evidence resembled a chess game, each move carefully considered, each countermove anticipated. The king's decision to proceed, backed by this body of evidence, was therefore not impulsive. It was calculated, strategic, and inevitable. By the time formal notices were being prepared, the magnitude of the evidence became clear even to the palace staff. It wasn't simply a handful of emails or isolated recordings. It was a systematic, comprehensive collection of material that documented a pattern of behavior over years. Advisors described it as a mosaic of actions, intentions, and contradictions, each piece reinforcing the others, leaving a narrative that was impossible to dispute. The weight of this accumulation was undeniable, and for the first time, the full scope of Harry's exposure was becoming clear, not only to the king but also to those tasked with executing the legal response. And as the team finalized the compilation, the tension within the palace reached a new peak. Legal experts, security advisors, and senior aides were acutely aware of the potential implications. Harry had, through a series of choices, created a situation in which his father could act decisively. The pieces were now in place for a legal strategy that would not only assert authority, but potentially redefine the boundaries of royal accountability. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and the stakes were nothing short of historic. But what came next, the first public signals of this meticulously gathered evidence being leveraged, would shock even the closest advisors. The world had no idea that the storm was about to break, and when it did, the consequences would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. Behind every decisive action in a monarchy, there is strategy. And in the case of King Charles's unprecedented legal move against Prince Harry, the strategy was not just legal. It was psychological, political, and deeply orchestrated. Imagine a room behind the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, filled with the kingdom's most trusted advisors, lawyers, and senior aides. The air is tense. Every word spoken carries weight, every gesture is calculated, and every eye is fixed on one objective: to ensure the king's authority is enforced while minimizing collateral damage. The advisors knew that history was watching, and any misstep could escalate what was already a volatile situation into a full-blown crisis that would dominate headlines worldwide. It began with alignment. The advisors had to synchronize the legal, public, and operational fronts of the strategy. On one hand, legal experts were dissecting the amassed evidence, emails, recordings, financial documents, and testimonies from staff and external contacts. They identified every potential leverage point and every vulnerability that could justify formal action. Each advisor understood that the law could be a double-edged sword. One misinterpreted clause, one poorly timed action, and Harry, or the media, could spin the narrative to his favor. Precision was everything. At the same time, communications experts were plotting a narrative. The monarchy had always been a symbol, not just a family, and public perception mattered as much as legal authority. Every press release, every subtle leak, and every message to loyal royal correspondents was carefully considered. Advisors debated whether to hint at the legal action, maintain complete silence, or release selective details to influence public sentiment. Timing was critical. The plan had to be airtight, coordinated across multiple layers, and executed in a way that underscored the king's control without creating an unnecessary backlash. The advisor's strategy also accounted for human behavior, Harry's behavior. Psychologists and royal etiquette experts were consulted to predict potential responses. Would Harry comply quietly? Would he lash out publicly? Would he seek allies outside the family? Each scenario was mapped out, with contingency plans prepared for every possible reaction. The palace was not just dealing with legal implications, it was anticipating emotional, psychological, and social dynamics, all of which could influence the trajectory of the crisis. In private discussions, advisors debated the sequence of actions. Should they confront Harry directly before public action, or should the evidence be leveraged through legal channels first? Some argued for a measured, private approach that would preserve family dignity. Others insisted that the public needed to witness the consequences to reinforce the principle that no one is above accountability. These debates were intense, often extending late into the night. Every scenario was simulated, every outcome predicted, and every risk assessed. The advisors were acutely aware that the wrong move could ignite not only public criticism, but also a rebellion within the palace staff and allied institutions. One critical element of the strategy involved controlling the flow of information. Advisors knew that leaks were inevitable, given the scale of the palace bureaucracy and the curiosity of the press. So, they implemented strict protocols, restricted access to documents, monitored communications, and even controlled movement within key areas of the palace. The team meticulously tracked who had access to what, ensuring that any breach could be quickly identified and mitigated. It was a high-stakes game of information warfare, with every detail scrutinized. The advisors also considered alliances. Within the royal household, loyalty is never guaranteed, and allies can become liabilities if not carefully managed. Identifying which aides could be trusted with sensitive information, which could be leveraged for support, and which posed a risk of leaking or undermining the king's objectives was a critical component of the strategy. In some cases, this required quiet negotiations, reassurances, or subtle pressure to ensure alignment. The palace staff became both participants in and observers of an unfolding drama that demanded both discretion and absolute loyalty. In parallel, the legal team prepared the initial filings, letters, and notices that would formalize the king's actions. Each document was drafted with precision, balancing authority and diplomacy. They accounted for potential counterclaims, media scrutiny, and public perception. Every word was deliberate, every paragraph designed to reinforce the king's position while minimizing the possibility of unintended consequences. The advisors understood that the legal strategy was not just about punishing Harry. It was about establishing a precedent for accountability within the monarchy itself. Psychological tactics were also embedded in the strategy. Advisors recognized that uncertainty can be a powerful motivator. By controlling the timing and scope of information, they could influence Harry's decisions, nudging him toward compliance or revealing vulnerabilities in his public persona. For example, selective hints about the evidence or the legal approach could sow doubt, force concessions, or prompt behavior that could further justify the king's actions. The palace was conducting a multidimensional chess game, where perception, influence, and law were all pieces on a single, complex board. There was also consideration of timing in relation to external events. Public appearances, media cycles, international obligations, and even holidays were factored into the strategy. Advisors understood that public sentiment is often shaped by context. By carefully timing announcements or leveraging public interest moments, the team could maximize impact, ensuring that the king's actions were both authoritative and compelling. The alignment of legal action with broader public perception was critical. Misalignment could undermine authority, while synchronization could reinforce it in dramatic, unforgettable ways. One particularly challenging aspect was anticipating Meghan Markle's influence. Advisors debated how to account for her potential interventions, statements, or alliances. While she was not the target of legal action, her proximity to Harry and her public profile meant she could indirectly affect outcomes. The strategy included contingencies for media statements, public appearances, or social media activity that might sway opinion or create legal complications. Advisors carefully considered every possible angle, from supportive statements to provocative actions, ensuring that the king's approach could withstand unexpected interference. Interestingly, the advisors also focused on the symbolic dimension. Royal actions are never purely practical. They carry symbolic weight, especially when addressing matters of accountability. Every move, from the way a document was served to the choice of legal language, was designed to communicate authority, reinforce protocol, and send a message not only to Harry but to the broader public. The monarchy remains vigilant, structured, and unyielding. The symbolism of action, carefully calibrated, was as important as the legal mechanics. Despite the careful planning, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Even the most meticulous strategy could be disrupted by unforeseen actions, leaks, or emotional responses. Advisors were acutely aware that Harry was unpredictable, capable of spontaneous decisions that could derail months of preparation. They had to account for every possibility, from defiance to compliance, from public statements to private alliances. The strategy was robust, but the human element remained the greatest variable. Finally, the advisors recognized that timing was everything. The moment to act had been chosen with care, after months of observation, analysis, and preparation. Legal action could not be rushed, and public perception could not be ignored. The king's move would be decisive, undeniable, and strategically framed to assert authority while maintaining the integrity of the monarchy. It was, in every sense, a culmination of years of preparation, observation, and strategic foresight. And just as the final pieces of the strategy were aligned, whispers began circulating about Harry's next potential moves. Advisors speculated on his public statements, his private consultations, and possible alliances. They knew that the first public signs of legal action would trigger a cascade of reactions. The palace was prepared, but even in preparation, no one could predict the full scale of what was about to unfold. What came next, the initial execution of this carefully plotted strategy, would be unlike anything the monarchy had ever attempted. And when it finally began, it would force Harry into a confrontation with the full weight of his father's authority, one that would test every relationship, every assumption, and every loyalty. The moment Prince Harry realized that his father, King Charles, was about to take unprecedented legal action, everything shifted. It wasn't just a legal threat. It was a seismic blow that threatened to unravel everything he had built over the past decade. Panic, denial, and defiance collided in a storm of emotion, each feeding into the next, creating a tension so intense it seemed to vibrate through the walls of Harry's private residence. For someone who had spent years carefully curating a public image, this was uncharted territory. And unlike the media spectacles he had orchestrated, this crisis was deeply personal, exposing vulnerabilities even he hadn't anticipated. The first response was panic. Advisors close to Harry reported that he spent hours reviewing his past decisions, scanning emails, texts, and interviews for potential weak points. Every word he had spoken publicly, every action taken without palace approval, suddenly became a liability. What had once seemed like personal expression or independence now felt like evidence against him. Heart racing, mind spinning, he realized that he had underestimated his father's resolve and the depth of the legal strategy being mobilized. Panic is a strange force. It amplifies fear, clouds judgment, and makes even small errors catastrophic. For Harry, every misstep now carried the weight of potential criminal exposure, public humiliation, and personal disgrace. Denial followed quickly. In private conversations with close confidants, Harry insisted that the situation was being exaggerated. "It's not that serious," he reportedly said, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. He leaned on past experiences, on the media cycles that had always seemed to protect him, on the public's perception of him as a sympathetic figure. But even as he spoke, there were cracks in his narrative. Advisors warned him that the accumulated evidence, from emails to private recordings, was far more damning than anything he had previously encountered. The denial, while natural, was unsustainable. Reality was closing in, and there was no easy escape. Defiance was the next stage. Harry's instinct, shaped by years of challenging royal conventions, was to resist. He considered public statements, potential media interviews, and even legal countermoves that might pressure his father to reconsider. In his mind, defiance wasn't reckless. It was a calculated assertion of independence. But the king's legal team had anticipated this. Every potential move Harry could make was already mapped out, with contingencies ready to neutralize any advantage he might attempt to leverage. His defiance, while emotionally satisfying in the moment, only added fuel to the king's strategic fire. Every act of resistance, every public comment, could be reframed as evidence of repeated disobedience or disrespect, further justifying the legal measures being deployed against him. In the private confines of his residence, Harry's panic, denial, and defiance played out in real time. Advisors described a series of intense phone calls, urgent messages, and late-night consultations with lawyers and confidants. Each interaction added layers of complexity, sometimes clarifying options, sometimes exacerbating confusion. There were moments of desperation, attempts to negotiate, and flashes of anger as he realized that his previous freedom to speak and act without consequence was rapidly evaporating. Every text, email, and media appearance now felt like a potential liability, a misstep in a legal and emotional minefield. What made this reaction particularly explosive was the public dimension. Harry understood that news of the legal action would inevitably leak. Social media would erupt. Media outlets would analyze every detail, often without context, amplifying fear and misperception. He had spent years mastering the art of controlling narrative, but this situation was different. The king's strategy was multi-layered, designed to preempt any attempt at public influence. Harry realized that for the first time, the narrative was no longer in his hands. The realization fueled a sense of vulnerability that only heightened his emotional turmoil. Advisors also noted a pattern in Harry's behavior: oscillation between extreme caution and bold defiance. One moment, he would meticulously review every potential statement and action, carefully plotting his next move. The next, he would consider drastic measures, public statements, strategic alliances, or appeals to sympathetic media outlets. This fluctuation reflected both his internal conflict and the intensity of the crisis. He was simultaneously terrified of consequences and driven by a desire to assert autonomy, creating a volatile combination that left everyone around him tense and uncertain. The role of Meghan Markle added another layer of complexity. Though she was not directly targeted by legal action, her proximity to Harry and her influence over his decisions were undeniable. Advisors reported that Harry frequently consulted her before making public statements or taking legal steps. Her presence was both stabilizing and destabilizing. Her counsel sometimes tempered panic, while at other times it reinforced defiance. The dynamic between them was a constant factor in the evolving strategy, both for Harry and for the king's team. Every action, every decision, every conversation was now observed and analyzed for potential leverage or consequence. Harry's reaction was not only emotional, it was strategic, albeit reactive. He began assembling his own legal counsel, consulting international experts, and evaluating potential defenses. Advisors noted that he became increasingly aware of the precedent-setting nature of the king's actions. This wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a legal and institutional moment that could redefine the monarchy's boundaries and set rules for accountability that had never existed before. The stakes were enormous, and Harry's response had to be carefully measured, even as panic and emotion threatened to derail his judgment. Irony played a cruel role in the unfolding events. Harry, who had spent years pursuing independence and crafting a narrative of personal freedom, was now trapped by that very independence. The public platforms he had used to assert himself were now channels that his father's team could scrutinize, analyze, and leverage as evidence. Every social media post, every interview snippet, every public appearance could be reframed to support the legal case. The tools Harry had once wielded for autonomy had become instruments of exposure, intensifying both panic and defiance. Amid the tension, Harry began contemplating options he had previously dismissed. Travel, temporary relocations, or legal maneuvering to delay proceedings were all considered. Advisors warned that any attempt to evade or manipulate the process could be interpreted as obstruction, compounding his legal exposure. The realization was sobering. There were no easy exits. Each choice carried risk, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. The sense of urgency, combined with the personal and public stakes, created a pressure cooker atmosphere, pushing Harry toward increasingly bold, sometimes reckless, decisions. As the initial legal actions were formally communicated, Harry's reaction intensified. Panic gave way to a defensive posture, and defiance began manifesting in public and private statements that sometimes contradicted each other. Observers noted the tension in his tone, the careful wording of interviews, and the subtle signals to allies and media contacts. Every move was a dance between risk and strategy, but even the most carefully considered actions were being countered by the king's meticulously prepared plan. Harry realized that he was now part of a chess game where the moves were both legal and psychological, and every piece on the board could influence his fate. By the end of the first week following the initial legal notice, Harry's internal state was a mix of dread and determination. Advisors described him as oscillating between moments of clarity and overwhelming anxiety. He recognized the scale of what was coming, the weight of evidence against him, the reach of his father's authority, and the historic nature of the legal action. The crisis was no longer abstract. It was real, immediate, and unavoidable. Every past decision, every public statement, every interaction was now part of a narrative that could either defend or condemn him. And as Harry began preparing for what he thought would be a manageable confrontation, the reality of the situation deepened. The legal and strategic frameworks were in place, the advisors had aligned, and King Charles's resolve was unshakable. What Harry did next, how he chose to confront the evidence, the legal strategy, and the psychological pressure, would determine not only the immediate outcome but also the future of his position within the royal family. But just when he thought he could anticipate the next steps, a single revelation from the king's legal team changed everything. And no one, not even Harry, was prepared for what would happen next. When the storm first began swirling around Prince Harry, Meghan Markle's role was not immediately obvious to the public. She wasn't the target of the king's legal action, yet her presence, her counsel, and her own public statements added a complex, volatile layer to the unfolding crisis. To understand the full scope of the escalation, one must examine how Meghan's influence intertwined with Harry's decisions and how it inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, shaped the trajectory of the conflict. From the beginning, Meghan had been a polarizing figure within the royal family. Admirers hailed her as a modern, independent woman unafraid to challenge outdated traditions. Critics painted her as manipulative, ambitious, and a destabilizing force. But the truth, as insiders reveal, is far more nuanced. Her influence on Harry was profound. Private advisors reported that Harry often deferred to her opinions on strategy, media responses, and even legal decisions. She was, in many ways, his partner in both public appearances and private decision-making. And as the legal threat from King Charles loomed larger, her role became increasingly pivotal. In the early days of the escalation, Meghan was instrumental in shaping Harry's initial reactions. She encouraged him to maintain composure publicly while simultaneously preparing defenses in private. But she also urged assertiveness that, while empowering in personal terms, created complications in the legal and public domains. Advisors noted that her insistence on a proactive stance sometimes clashed with Harry's instinct for caution, resulting in a series of mixed messages to both the palace and the media. What was meant to be a strategy of measured resistance quickly morphed into a high-stakes balancing act, and every miscalculation amplified the pressure on Harry. One of the most significant ways Meghan escalated the situation was through her own public statements and social media activity. Although she was careful not to directly challenge the king, her messaging often carried implicit support for Harry's defiance and subtle critiques of the monarchy. These statements, when combined with Harry's own media appearances, contributed to a growing narrative of rebellion and discontent. Legal advisors within the palace noted that even indirect references to the king or royal protocols could be construed as provocative, strengthening the case for formal action. In effect, Meghan's presence amplified the stakes, transforming what might have been a contained legal matter into a full-blown public spectacle. It wasn't only public appearances that mattered. Meghan's influence extended deep into private discussions, particularly regarding strategic counsel. She was actively involved in reviewing legal documents, advising on potential media narratives, and suggesting allies and public channels that could be leveraged to defend Harry.